And we are continuing to cover the breaking news out of Florida as we look live inside a Broward County courtroom where at any moment we'll learn the fate of the gunman behind the massacre at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. A jury has reached a decision on whether to sentence him to life or death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. CNN's Carlos Suarez is outside the courthouse in Fort Lauderdale. Carlos, what more can you tell us? The jury began deliberations just yesterday.
That's exactly right, Bianna. They spent a full day deliberating whether or not Nikolas Cruz is going to die for his actions. They only had a few questions about some of the witness testimony, and then one of the last things they did, at least to our understanding, is they asked to see that AR-15 that Cruz used in court. Now, the jury was looking at 17 counts of first-degree murder. Cruz had already pleaded guilty to each of one of those counts, so they were just deciding his fate on every single one of those charges. Essentially, what they had to do was decide whether or not Cruz committed an aggravating factor, essentially a reason that the state said he should be put to death. They had about 5 of them for each of the 17 victims. The defense, they offered up dozens of what they called mitigating factors, reasons that they believe that Cruz should be spared his life and instead should be sentenced to life in prison. We were expecting the deliberation process to play out for a few more days just because each of the 17 counts had 4 pages of questions that the jurors needed to answer. Each of those questions was looking at the aggravating factors, the mitigating factors. It was possible that the jury could come back on an aggravating factor and a mitigating factor, and then they had to decide whether or not any of those factors outweighed the other. Once they got that done, then they would go ahead and decide whether or not he would die for his actions in Parkland, Florida back in 2018. It is important to note that in the state of Florida, a jury's decision on death has to be unanimous, but they only have to be unanimous on one of these charges in order for Cruz to die. If the jury were to hold out on all of them, well, then Cruz, of course, would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. We are expecting the verdict to be read in court. My understanding is that Cruz is already back inside the courtroom up on the 17th floor of the judicial building here behind me. The Parkland families have been here throughout this entire process. We've been covering this case since jury selection got underway 5 to 6 months ago, and then the witness testimony got underway about 3 months ago. And all of these family members have been in that courtroom every single day for several hours. I mean, the witness testimony at times would go on for 4 to 5 hours, and sometimes we would only hear from 2 people a day. The jury themselves, they visited the school. They got a look at a 14-minute piece of video showing Cruz going floor by floor at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, shooting these 17 people. They got a look at all of the autopsy photos, and so now they are just waiting to come out, deliver their verdict, and then we will learn whether or not Nikolas Cruz will die for what he did in Parkland, Florida. Bianna?
Cruz was 19 years old at the time of the shooting, 24 years old now. We see the family members there. As you said, they have been there throughout this trial, and obviously this is a big moment for them as we're expecting to hear from the jury. I want to bring in CNN's Gene Caceres, who has been also following this trial, and CNN legal analyst Paul Callan. So, Gene, let me ask you to get your response to the moment the jury asked to see the AR-15 that was used in that murder. How significant, if anything, was that?
Well, you know, it's a short deliberation, and they've asked for a couple of things, one being the AR-15. And I think it's fascinating that yesterday there was an issue because they didn't know if it could go back to the jury room. The prosecutor said it has to go back to the jury room. So what they did is they took the firing pin out. And this morning, when they got to that jury room, the gun was right there. So that's significant. But yesterday, they asked for a readback of Dr. Paul Connor, an expert on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, who testified that Nikolas Cruz was the victim, you could say, of what his mother ingested while she was pregnant with him, and it affected his brain. And there was such an impact that it was in part responsible for what he did and why he did it. Now, of course, they also got a readback of the cross-examination, but they did not want a readback of Dr. Paul Denny, a clinical neuropsychologist who actually testified that Nikolas Cruz manipulated the numbers on his assessment test, that he did this intentionally to make sure he looked as bad as it could to help him so that the jury would not render a verdict of death. They didn't want to hear that testimony. They just wanted the defense expert. And as we just heard, they have to be unanimous. And they obviously have a verdict in this short period of time. But to render a verdict of death, it has to be unanimous. It is a recommendation only. In Florida, the judge decides what the ultimate decision is. She usually listens to the recommendation of the jury. But if they did not able to get unanimity on death, it will be life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, they go through each and every victim, all 17. And if solely on one victim they believe beyond a reasonable doubt that he should be sentenced to death, then it is a death verdict. And the prosecutor also already proved some aggravating factors, heinous, atrocious, and cruel, things like that. And the jury has to believe beyond a reasonable doubt at least one aggravating factor is in place for that verdict of death. So you see the process is set up to be very, very foolproof. They really have to believe that. And, you know, it wasn't too long ago that it was changed to a unanimous verdict in Florida. Before that, there were other rules in Florida, but I've covered many death penalty cases in Florida. This is the shortest deliberation I've ever seen.
And so, Paul, what do you read into that, given that it was a short deliberation? They just began yesterday, and as of this morning, they already reached a verdict.
I read into it that there are so many victims of this homicide. This is a mass shooting. It's one of the biggest mass shootings in American history. Not the biggest, but certainly it's right up there. And I think when you see that many human beings slaughtered in a crime like this, that the death penalty is going to be seriously considered by a jury. As Jean explained, the statute is very, very complicated in terms of what the jury has to go through. There are 8 aggravating factors that are listed as possibilities. And there are mitigating factors. There are 16 aggravating factors and 8 mitigating factors. And the jury has to look at each one of these to decide whether the aggravating ones outweigh the mitigating ones. I think here, Bianna, that when they asked to see that AR-15 in the jury room, I think they were looking at the aggravating factor that has to do with the crime being particularly heinous or cruel. And I think they wanted to look at the weapon and to try to make a decision as to whether killing somebody with a weapon like that AR-15 is an aggravating factor under the statute. So that probably was the most important aggravating factor the jury looked at. But we'll see that eventually when we see their answers to the judge's questions.
And Carlos, talk about, and you discussed this earlier, you touched on it earlier, the impact that the family is sitting there days after day throughout this trial that they brought to the courtroom and to potentially this verdict and decision by the jury. They have not only been outspoken and been demanding justice for their loved ones immediately after the massacre, but now all these years later throughout the actual trial itself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One of the more emotional weeks of this entire sentencing trial was when we heard from the family members. They all went on the stand and talked about their loss, their grief, and how many of them have not been able to move forward with their lives. It's important to note that the jury was told that they were not to take into account any of the victims' statements when deciding whether or not Cruz would die because of what he did back in 2018. But to add to some of what's been said, some of the observations being made here, one of the things that the prosecution spent a great deal of time and effort through this entire process was trying to underscore, trying to highlight just how cruel Cruz was the day of the shooting. During closing arguments, the prosecutor out here, he went into great detail showing how for some of his victims, Nicholas Cruz walked up to them, shot them several times at point-blank range just to make sure that they were dead. The jury then also got a look at a 14-minute-long piece of video showing the shooting. And so at least in our understanding of what was going on in the observations that we made in court, it seemed pretty clear that the prosecution was confident that they were going to be able to get some of these aggravating factors on 3 to 4 of the students because they had just spent so much time and effort walking the jury through just how they died. Walking Oliver, one of the victims, he was hiding in a corner, and surveillance video at the school captured Cruz walking up to him and shooting him after he'd already been shot. And so our understanding is the surveillance video shows Oliver already wounded when Cruz walks up to him and shoots him several times. Peter Wang, he was one of the other students that was killed here. He was shot more than a dozen times, including in the head. And that was something that the prosecution wanted jurors to remember as they went into this deliberation. And so it seemed that they were pretty confident that they were going to get some of these aggravating factors on some of these students, if not all of the 17 victims.
Again, we're looking at the families there in a packed courtroom of the loved ones, the 17 that were murdered by Nicholas Cruz, 14 students, 3 staff members back in 2018. The jury has reached a verdict, and stay with us. Of course, we're going to be continuing to watch the process inside that courtroom. In just minutes, we are expecting to hear that jury recommendation to be shared in the trial of Nicholas Cruz. Of course, we will bring it to you live.